All right, so we are going to get started. We're here for the presentation of the 2023 gaps analysis for the Western PA CoC. My name is Jessica Stones. I work with DMA. We're the consultant for the Eastern and Western Pennsylvania CoCs. So I'm going to give a little bit of background about what the gaps analysis is, how we use the information before we dive in, and I'll go through some logistics as well. So the CoC has been conducting an annual gaps analysis for the past 4 years. And the point of the gaps analysis is really to analyze what resources does the CoC currently have to serve folks experiencing homelessness, how many folks experiencing homelessness are seeking resources and in need of resources, and then based on how many folks need resources and what resources are available, where are the biggest gaps in the CoC. So the process has evolved over the last few years. We now use Tableau, which I'll give you a little orientation to. It's a web-based platform, so you can view this in your computer browser once we send you out the link. And you can really use this to drill into the data and look at data at your local level and understand what might be happening, with different subpopulations, counties, things like that. So how we use the information is definitely used by the funding committee and the CoC board to really understand where to prioritize new resources. I hope that RABs use the information to look at what are the gaps within your RAB and where do gaps need to be filled. And then I believe committees also can benefit greatly from the information. So for example, the CoC's DEI committee or the coordinated entry committee really drilling into some of the data to understand where the needs are specific to kind of your scope of work. And we hope it's really helpful for you at the program level as well, because there's a lot of information within the analysis that you can use to say where are the needs and gaps in my community. And for example, if you're going in for new funding, you can really target your proposal using your local data. So those are some of the ways we hope you can use the information. A little bit of logistics. Anytime in the presentation, you can feel free to type a question in the chat. I believe that Lee and/or Sierra from DMA will be joining at some point and can help field those questions in the chat, but I'll also take some pauses throughout to field questions as they come in. We are recording this presentation, and we'll be sending out the recording as well as the link to Tableau following the presentation. At the end of the presentation, I will also put the Tableau link in the chat, but I prefer to wait till the end to do that so that everyone can kind of be present reviewing the information as it's presented. And then after the presentation, you can use some time to kind of drill into your local data. Alrighty, with all of that background information, let me just orient you a little bit to Tableau for when you do get the link. You'll get a link that you can put into your browser, and I would highly recommend that you view it in full screen, which is this little rectangle at the bottom. It's much easier. The view should adjust to the size of your particular screen, so I find it a lot easier to view in full screen mode. So to start us off, what does the gaps analysis include? So we're going to be looking at what the current resource landscape is in the CoC. What are the resources that currently exist for folks experiencing homelessness? We're going to look at coordinated entry data. So who is seeking services within the CoC? And then we're going to bring it all together at the end, looking at, based on the demand for services and the supply, where are the biggest gaps? And I will orient you to some of the Tableau features as we go. So when you're reviewing this on your own, there is a table of contents. I have this little note at the top. If you're crunched for time or you don't want to review every single tab, which is fair, you can use the table of contents and focus on these slides that are underlined. That's really kind of the key slides, about 6 key slides where you can get most of the information you might need, but some of you may want to dig deeper into some of the data, so we have a lot more data available. Just some considerations and limitations. In terms of coordinated entry data, we're looking at data over a 12-month period, so data from January 2022 to December 2022, and we're looking at data for unduplicated households. So even if a household came through coordinated entry twice, they're only reflected in the data once. Then we're going to look at the housing inventory data. For this, we use the 2023 housing inventory count, but we're also looking at the inventory a little bit differently, which I'll explain when we get to the housing inventory, trying to look at the data a little bit more accurately because of some of the limitations of the housing inventory count. So as you all know, coordinated entry data doesn't look at everything. It doesn't capture all of the needs that a household might have who's coming to coordinated entry for assistance. So what we're primarily looking at in this analysis is folks who need housing or prevention resources to end their homelessness. So we're not really looking at supportive service needs. That's beyond the scope of what we're looking at. There is missing data, which you'll be able to see throughout, including households where we don't know their RAB or their county or their prior living situation, things like that. We did do the analysis a little bit different this year to account for some of that missing domestic violence survivor data. And I think we've made progress since last year. There's still some limitations in terms of data gaps, but I think the data will give us a better picture of some of that data that we've been missing in the past. So even with some of these limitations, the data does help provide that big picture look at what's happening in the CoC. So what we're hoping you all will do today is review the data with us, and then after this presentation, dig into the data for your RAB, for your county. You could do this within your RAB meetings, your committee meetings, and then really see what gaps you're seeing in your communities. There may be gaps that aren't reflected in this analysis that you think are really important. You can submit feedback on the gaps analysis. You can email it to the CoC email address, which we'll make sure you have at the end. And then consider whether to apply for new funding based on the needs in your community. There are some funding opportunities that are going to be coming out soon, like CoC, new project applications, ESG applications. So use this data to really craft your proposals for those type of funding. And then things to think about as we're going through the gaps analysis. What do you see as the needs in your community? What areas do you want to explore further? Do you need additional information? Where should the priorities be? Things like that. There's a couple other tabs with resources. If you're not familiar with some of these housing terms or some of the eligible costs, for example, for CoC, ESG, and Home for Good funding, there's a little cheat sheet there. And for everyone who's on this call, if you have not reviewed the CoC 101 and 201 training materials that are on the CoC website, please check those out. You'll be able to see the link when we send this out. It's really helpful, especially if you have someone on your team that's new, but even for folks who've been doing this work a while, it's a helpful resource. And then we're going to get into the coordinated entry terminology later, but this will be a cheat sheet when you come back. And then there's some Tableau tips, but I'm going to walk through these as we go. All right, so let's dive in. The first thing I want to show you is, again, I mentioned if you don't want to go through everything in the analysis, you can kind of go through some of these key slides. The first thing I want to highlight is this coordinated entry dashboard. So this is a single page where you can see things like the total folks accessing coordinated entry by RAB. I'm going to get into the estimate versus actual in a moment. Total folks accessing coordinated entry by subpopulation. Total coordinated entry enrollment. Percentage of households exiting to permanent housing through coordinated entry. The average length of time folks are waiting for housing. And then the annual housing and service demand. I'm going to get into every single one of these elements as we go, but just want to orient you to what's on this slide. So you can drill into this by RAB or by county and just see the information for your specific county. So for example, in Armstrong County, 145 households accessing coordinated entry. You could see the subpopulations, the percentage of folks who exited to permanent housing, and the other folks, what happened to those folks, and then the annual service demand. And again, I'll give more details on what all of this means. A couple of Tableau tips: if you start filtering things and then want to go back to the original view, you can either press these little X's above the filter, or if you want the entire page to go back, just press this little refresh button at the top and it'll go back to the original view. I'm going to get into this in a bit, but you'll see here there's a section that says total accessing CE by RAB estimate and total accessing CE by RAB actual. So on this total accessing CE by RAB actual, these are the actual households that came through. And you can see 21% of the households is missing their RAB. And that's mostly because in HMIS, a lot of the data for domestic violence survivors is not captured in the HMIS coordinated entry system for confidentiality reasons. That data is kept by the DV providers and the CE folks. So what we did this year is we worked with Dan Carney, who's the coordinated entry chair, and we worked with Alex at PCADV, the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, to figure out, is there a better way we can try to account for these missing folks? Someone knows what RAB they're in. So we worked with Dan to get some de-identified data, so data on where the survivors were coming from, but not with their specific like names or anything identifying. So when we did that, we have a better estimate of where households are coming. So when we extrapolate for the missing data, meaning we kind of apply a formula to try to apply where are all these 662 missing households coming from. Our estimate is that 60% of the households coming through coordinated entry are in the Southwest RAB, 36% in the Northwest RAB. We're still missing that info for about 3% of the households, and then you'll see about 2% of the households are outside of the CoC. I'm going to get into this in a bit, but we think this by extrapolating for the missing data where we can understand more about what the needs are of DV survivors. You might have noticed this, but if you're looking at a chart and you can't tell, like it's too small to see what the data is, you can hover over it and you can see, okay, this red sliver is, the missing RAB. There was 87 households, and that was 3% of the total households. So definitely use the hover over feature to drill into the data if you can't see it. So that's the dashboard. Again, we're going to get into all of this, but this is a good place to start if you're looking at the slides through the Tableau analysis on your own. Alrighty, and then there's a CE dashboard drill down. So what this is another dashboard you can use to really drill into a lot of the different types of data in the analysis. So for example, if you want to see all the county, where folks are coming from by county all on one page, you can use that. Now this is the actual by county, meaning you're still going to have those 662 missing folks who we don't know their county, but you can use this to drill in and say, okay, let's see, how about youth by county? You can see here, Butler has the highest number of youth, followed by some of the other counties. So you can use this to kind of get a snapshot of the actual households coming through by county. But again, always keep in mind if there's some missing data, so you can use it in context. And then the other tabs allow you to look at analysis by RAB, analysis by race, ethnicity, analysis by household size, and analysis by age in several different ways. So let's look at race, ethnicity. So what this shows you is the total households accessing coordinated entry by race. You'll see here 63% white, non-Hispanic, 22% unknown, 10% Black, non-Hispanic. And again, the unknown, a lot of it is DV survivors, but also folks who just don't want to share that. And then you can drill into other things, like let's see what the average VI SPDAT score was by race. And I'm going to get into all of this later, so I'm not going to spend too much time. You can look at the average length of time to permanent housing by race. And you can really use this to see if there might be some, differences or disparities. The percentage of permanent housing exits by race, and it shows the percent and the total household. So we're going to get into all of this, but just want to orient you to this dashboard. It's definitely something you can use as a resource as you're going back to this on your own. All right, so we looked at the dashboard. I'm going to get into the housing inventory. Don't get overwhelmed by this chart or this tab. There's a lot of info, but I'm going to orient you to what's here. So what we're going to be looking at is all of the homeless dedicated housing inventory in the Western PA CoC. So what we used to look at this is we looked at the 2023 housing inventory count. That's what we have to submit to HUD each year to say, these are all of the programs in the CoC that are dedicated to serving people experiencing homelessness. This is how many units they are. This is what their funding source is. Many of you participate in the HIC process and answer all of my emails about your program that I send you. So we use that. However, there is a limitation to the housing inventory count, a couple of limitations. One is that for rapid rehousing, HUD only wants to know how many rapid rehousing units you had in use the night of the PIT count, which is not that helpful sometimes because you may have a program that only has 10 units in use the night of the PIT count, but you're funded for 30 units. So it's really misleading to say that you only have 10 units. And then the other issue with the housing inventory count is we have a lot of projects in the CoC that serve multiple counties, either neighboring counties or entire regions. And that's not reflected on the housing inventory count because we can only assign a project to one, what HUD calls a geocode. So what we did instead for this year is for rapid rehousing, we took the total funded units for CoC, meaning if you're a CoC program and you're funded for 30 units, this page shows 30 units. It's not going to show just what you had in use on the PIT count night. And then we also divvied up the inventory by county. So if you have a rapid rehousing project or a PSH project that serves multiple counties, we basically divided up the inventory amongst those counties, which is a little bit more accurate. So for example, the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, they have a rapid rehousing program that serves the entire CoC. You know, it's not really fair to just assign that entire inventory to one county like we have to do for HUD. So we ended up dividing the inventory by county. And, you know, if you want to get into the weeds of how we did that, there's some explanation at the bottom of how we did that. But basically, if you're a CoC grantee, we divvied it up based on your grant application to HUD. And if you're like an ESG grantee, if you serve multiple counties, we divided your inventory evenly. So sorry for all the background before I actually dive in, but just want to give that context because this is a little different than just your normal housing inventory count for HUD. So how you can use this is you can really drill in to see the inventory for your specific county or RAB. So for example, say you want to see where are the CoC funded units in the CoC. So you can filter by CoC funded units, and then you can see kind of how that plays out. On the next tab, if you were like, well, what are the units that actually serve Forest County that are CoC funded? You can use the next tab for that. I'll show you that in a minute. So again, if you want to remove the filters, just press the refresh button at the top. Or if you want to see, okay, where are the DV dedicated units in the CoC? Where are the veteran dedicated units? Where are the units that serve just families, for example? So you can really drill into this data and kind of see what you want to see. One tip that I will show you is on any display that has the RABs, you can drill into the RABs by county. So I'm going to show you. Let's say we want to see every county in the Southwest RAB and what their inventory is. I'm going to filter by Southwest. And then there's like a little plus sign down here at the bottom next to Southwest. And if I open that up, then you're going to see every county within the Southwest RAB. You'll see how many emergency shelter units they have, how many transitional housing, how many rapid rehousing, how many permanent supportive housing, and how many other permanent housing. So this might be really helpful at the RAB level to kind of compare, you know, what the inventory is. Maybe there's counties with a lot of resources or counties with very few resources. You can use this to think about, you know, where the gaps are and if you want to, you know, work with your neighboring counties on things. So definitely use this as a resource to understand what the inventory is in your community. I mentioned, you know, if you're curious, okay, who are these Butler units? Where are they? What programs? On the next tab, you can actually see the raw data. And again, this is mostly from the housing inventory count, but if you are a program that serves multiple counties or you're a rapid rehousing project, like I mentioned, we divvied those units up a little differently for accuracy purposes, but you can drill in and say, okay, I want to see what the Fayette programs are. And you can see, for example, the shelters in Fayette, the other permanent housing in Fayette, the permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, transitional housing. So you can use that. But again, if you have questions, reach out, but make sure you check out the methodology at the bottom. If you're like, wait, Fayette County Regional Rapid has more than 6 units, it's because we divided the units over all the counties that are served by that project. Hopefully that makes sense. Alrighty, so that's a resource for you that you can use to really understand the inventory in your community. So just wanted to display, I mentioned the housing inventory count we have to submit to HUD. So this shows how many units the CoC has reported to HUD on its housing inventory count over the last several years. So you'll see most of the unit counts have been maybe gone down a little static. The rapid rehousing is a little bit misleading. I just want to make a note because, again, for the housing inventory count for HUD, we only report the number of rapid rehousing units in use on the night of the PIT count. You'll see here, it looks like there was a big dip, and there was in terms of the number of units in use the night of the PIT count. But some of that is because, as you all know, it's super hard to find units right now, and folks are struggling. There was also some kind of like shifts, specifically with ESG funding, that kind of happened that impacted the PIT numbers. But a slightly more accurate way to see kind of how the CoC's funding has adjusted over time is to look at the CoC funding from 2017 to 2022. This only looks at CoC program funding, so it doesn't look at ESG or other things. But you can see here, you know, over time, the permanent supportive housing money has gone up a little bit, but pretty static. The rapid rehousing funds have grown exponentially since 2017. A lot of that is because of the domestic violence dedicated rapid that has been awarded to Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Not all of those units are quote unquote online yet. The programs are still kind of rolling out. So we won't see the full impact of that until maybe next year or the year after. And then you can see here at the bottom, if you click on any of the categories, you can see it highlighted, but it gets a little crowded down here because there's a lot of programs with less than $1 million that are down here. But you can see here, for example, coordinated entry. There's been a big investment in coordinated entry from $230,000 in 2017 to a little over $700,000 in 2022. All right, and if you want to just see the CoC funding by RAB, this tab, FY 2022 CoC funding by RAB, looks at the housing and service funding awarded in this most recent NOFO cycle. Specifically for housing and services, we don't look at things like HMIS or coordinated entry on this tab because those resources apply across the entire CoC. But you can see here, you know, based on the most recent award, 47% of the CoC fund, 26% in the Northwest, and 27% in the entire CoC. And if you want to dig into this a little bit, you could say, okay, let's see where the DV dedicated resources are in the CoC, and you could see, you know, a large amount specifically for DV dedicated rapid. If you want to see just the chronic dedicated resource, so you can kind of dig in if you're interested in more information about the RABs and how those are funded through CoC funds. All right, so now we're going to shift gears to coordinated entry. So what this tab shows is coordinated entry trends over time. So in like this light teal color, you could see the unduplicated households accessing coordinated entry. So 2,953 households in 2019, 3,122 in 2022. So a small increase, but fairly static. A dip in 2020, which I think would probably be attributed to COVID-19 and just folks, you know, not being able to kind of get out and about and access services. And then this tab shows a snapshot of active households on December 31st of each year. And you'll see here there's been a big decrease from 937 in 2021 to 266. My guess is that this is heavily attributed to the cleanup of the coordinated entry list by the coordinated entry managers. And Jamie Ferry, who's the CE person, is on. Dan Carney wasn't able to be on, but if you want to add anything to that, Jamie, feel free. But my guess is that this decrease is largely just due to going through the list, cleaning it up, and things like that.
That's correct. We have been able to, and I say we as in the CE specialists, have been able to do an immense cleanup with the help of the folks from the different agencies. So kudos to everybody involved in helping out with that.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jamie. So folks couldn't, it was cutting in and out a bit, but Jamie was saying a lot of work's gone into cleaning up the list. So thank you all for your work on that. I think it really helps us have a more accurate picture. And Lee's comment about 2020, about the eviction moratorium, that is a excellent point, Lee. Thank you. All right, so let's see what's happening with coordinated entry in 2022. Who's accessing coordinated entry? So during 2022, 3,122 households accessed coordinated entry. So again, I mentioned this actual versus estimate. So this is the actual households in terms of what RAB they were identified as, 50% Southwest, 26% Northwest, but we have this 21% missing. So again, I worked with Dan Carney and PCADV around like, how do we fill some of these gaps? Because it's really hard to understand what's happening if you're missing, so much data. So we worked with Dan to get some de-identified data. And this is my best estimate at where folks are coming from by RAB. So about 60% in the Southwest, 36% in the Northwest, and then you're still missing a bit, but much more comprehensive data in order to understand, where some of those DV survivors are coming from. All right, so in terms of total accessing by RAB and household type, again, this is the actual households, but again, we're missing a lot of folks. So when we estimated based on the DV households, you can see here, about 76% of the households in the Southwest identified as singles and couples, 78% in the Northwest, and then we're missing still some data. And then 24% of the households in the Southwest identified as families with children and 20% in the Northwest. So that kind of gives you a sense of where, what type of households are presenting to coordinated entry. So if we want to look at the total folks accessing by county, again, we use the actual versus the estimate. So in the actual data, you can see here, it's really hard to understand where folks are coming from by county when we're missing, 600 folks. So we used this, we used an estimate to estimate where folks are coming from by county. So when we use the estimate, you could see here 514 households in Westmoreland, 421 Washington, 415 in Butler, 272 in Lawrence, and so forth. And quite a few folks outside of the CoC who seek services. You can use this filter to see, of these 514 households in Westmoreland, how many were DV survivors. And again, it's our best estimate by county. So you could see here, of those households, 193 DV survivors in Westmoreland, 149 in Lawrence, and so forth. So if you want to get a sense of how many DV survivors are presenting to coordinate entry in your county, you can get a pretty good estimate here. And then this map, you can start to drill down into the map by some of these subpopulations, but please take it with a grain of salt and make sure you look at this missing county at the bottom. I can't drill into all of this for DV survivors. Like, I can't drill into all of these types of data points for individual survivors. So you can use this though to see, for example, how many youth are presenting in your county, and there's only 11 missing. So that's a pretty good estimate. You can use it to see how many families or how many singles. So one thing I'll note here is you can see how many folks were active on the by name list on 12/31/22. So we're still awaiting housing. You could kind of see the total numbers. And again, that's hugely attributed to the CE specialists for all the data cleanup they did. So you can use that to kind of drill into your county, but make sure you keep in mind some of the missing data, just so you could take the data in context. We also look at total accessing coordinated entry by race and ethnicity. So the majority of households accessing coordinate entry identify as white, non-Hispanic, some unknown, as you know, and then followed by Black, non-Hispanic, Hispanic, Latino. This year, we combined race and ethnicity into one view for a couple reasons. One, starting later in 2023, when HUD rolls out their new data standards, HUD's actually combining race and ethnicity into one data element in HMIS. So something to look out for. It is, in my opinion, a helpful way to look at race and ethnicity combined. Because when you parse out race and ethnicity, you can kind of miss some of the nuances of what's happening. So you'll see that coming up, and then you can drill in and see, you know, well, what's the breakdown for youth specifically? What's the breakdown for veterans? You can drill into that data a bit. One thing folks have expressed an interest in understanding is what's the percentage of folks coming to coordinated entry by race versus the total population? Like, for example, are folks of certain races overrepresented in the population, things like that. So what this does is this looks at all the households who access coordinated entry who were literally homeless. We excluded the DV survivors from this analysis because we don't have the race information, so it skews the data. So we're just looking at those literally homeless households, and then we compared it to the census. So of all the folks in the Western Pennsylvania CoC, we looked at the overall population by race. So what you'll see here is 82.9% of the literally homeless households accessing coordinate entry identified as white, followed by 12.9% Black or African American, and so forth. 96% identify as non-Hispanic, 2% Hispanic Latino. And then you can compare that to the total population. So what I will direct your attention to is something that is not surprising. It's very consistent with what folks are seeing nationally, but Black or African American households are significantly overrepresented in the homeless population nationally, and also in the Western PA CoC. So you'll see 12.9% of households accessing coordinate entry identify as Black or African American, but they make up only 2.6% of the general population. So just something to keep in mind. And then Hispanic Latino households are slightly overrepresented in the overall population, only make up 1.5% of the population in the Western PA CoC. One new thing that we looked at this year by request is folks were interested in knowing who's accessing coordinated entry by, sorry, that should say household size, I'll fix that, by household size and by age. So the average household size for all households coming through coordinated entry was 1.5 people. So when you look at it, you could see here 1,870 households coming through coordinate entry were household size of 1, 390 household size of 2, and so forth. And then you could kind of drill into this by household type. And then you could see the total accessing coordinate entry by age. The majority of households coming through coordinate entry were 31 to 54. These age ranges are based on the age ranges that they use to within the DV anonymous coding. These are the age ranges that folks report for DV survivors. There may be an interest in changing the what age ranges we look at, because this doesn't really align with kind of the age ranges HUD looks at. But 31 to 54 includes more people because it's like a 15-year gap, whereas these other ones are only 5-year gaps. So we can look at that, maybe changing that in the future. But then you can drill into it by youth or by veterans, for example. You could see here veterans skew older, which is probably not surprising, but you see a significant group of the veterans are over 60 years old. Majority are household size of 1. You can drill into it for other information such as chronically homeless. And then again, you can drill into this for your county or your RAB. So the subpopulations accessing coordinated entry, this particular slide you can't drill down into, but you can drill down into the other slides like total accessing CE by county, by subpopulation. So you'll see here 1,908 households coming through coordinate entry. We're not a part of any of these 4 subpopulations. 789 identified as DV survivors, 303 youth, 24 and under, 197 veterans, and 76 chronically homeless. So the next thing we're looking at in the analysis is the average VI-SPDAT score. So just want to orient folks to this if this is new to you or you're not familiar. So the coordinate entry system uses an assessment tool called the VI-SPDAT, which stands for Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool. It's an assessment. Every CoC kind of has to have a standardized assessment for prioritizing households for limited resources. So in the Western PA CoC, they're currently using the VI-SPDAT, though that may change at some point in the future. So this tool, each household is administered this assessment, which looks at different types of vulnerabilities or barriers they may face as they seek housing, and each household is assigned a score, and the score is kind of a component that goes into prioritizing households for resources. So you can see here the average VI-SPDAT score by household type and RAB. Families are going to have a higher average score because the family assessment has a higher range for the score. And singles and couples are going to have a lower range of score. That's just based on the way the tool is set up. It's not necessarily like a disparate, or it's not a disparity. It's just the way the tool is set up. But one thing that's of interest is families with children in the Northwest are scoring higher on average than the Southwest, and singles as well. That may be something you want to drill into, again, by county. So for example, if you wanted to open up these tabs, you could see here, are there certain counties where folks are skewing lower or skewing higher? I will caution you, make sure you hover over it and see how many households it is. For example, Potter County, we're talking about 2 households. So it's kind of hard to draw conclusions about anything when we're only talking about 2 households, but this may be something that RABs or LHOTs or Coordinate Entry Committee want to dig into a little bit more. And then you could also drill into things like veterans, youth, and chronically homeless to see if there's any major differences going on. But again, make sure you hover over it and see how many households. Generally, when you see an outlier like this, when you actually drill into it, you'll see, okay, this was actually only 1 household. So you can use this locally to kind of drill in and see what might be going on. And this may be really helpful, as the coordinate entry process is being kind of revamped to kind of understand, is there consistency across how the process is happening across different counties? Are there differences? Do those differences account for some of these, differences in score? So these are kind of tools you can use locally to dig in a little bit more. We also look at the VI-SPDAT score by race and ethnicity. Again, we include the raw number here because you do have to take it in context. There's very few households presenting to coordinated entry who are American Indian or Asian American or Native Hawaiian. So we include those here, but make sure you take into account the raw number, because if it's a very small number, it's very difficult to kind of make meaning of it. But you can see here for families, white non-Hispanic families, there's 516 with an average score of 8.1, and Black non-Hispanic families, an average score of 8, and non-Hispanic families, an average score of 8. So very similar scores by race for families. For singles and couples, you could see here, white non-Hispanic households score an average of 6.3, Hispanic Latino households 6.0, and Black non-Hispanic households 5.2. So you could see here for singles and couples, white singles and couples were scoring higher on average than Black singles and couples. What I would encourage you to do is drill into this for your RAB and county. This varies greatly by RAB and county in terms of differences. So drill into it and look at it a little bit deeper, but definitely keep in context the total number, because if it's a very small number, just a handful of households, you can't really make much of that because the numbers start to get too small. All right, I'm going to take a quick pause before I go to our next section. I didn't see any questions in the chat, but if folks have any questions, Feel free to raise your hand or type them in the chat and we can answer them as they go. Alrighty, feel free to chime in if you think of a question. You could either raise your hand via the reactions button. I think you should have a reactions button, or you can type it in the chat. The next thing we look at is length of time on the by name list. So if you see this acronym LOT on BNL, sorry for the acronym. It's length of time on the by name list. So basically, for folks who are literally homeless or fleeing domestic violence, they are assessed through coordinated entry and then added to the by name list, which is basically the prioritization list of all the households who are homeless or fleeing DV and who need are seeking housing assistance through coordinated entry. So what this looks at is the average length of time that folks are waiting on the by name list. So the first set of charts, we break it out by what HUD calls leavers and stayers. Leavers are all the households who exited the by name list, and stayers is everyone who was still on the by name list at the end of the reporting period. So you can see here the average length of time on the by name list for the Northwest and Southwest RAB was very similar for leavers, folks who exited, and then the Northwest RAB had a higher length of time for stayers. What I find to be slightly more helpful is the second chart, which is how long did folks wait on the by name list who exited to permanent housing? You could see here there were 397 households in the Northwest RAB who exited to permanent housing, and on average they were on the by name list for 101 days. And then in the Southwest RAB, there were 643 households who exited to permanent housing, and their average length of time was 79 days. So the average length of time is longer in the Northwest, but again, you can use this drill down feature because again, it varies greatly by county. But again, Venango, small amount of counties, Elk, or small amount of households. So definitely hover over it and see. But you'll see here, for example, Washington County, which has a lot of households coming through, had a pretty long wait compared to some of its counterparts in the Southwest RAB. So you can kind of use this to see, is there certain counties where folks are waiting a long time for housing? And then you can also drill into this by subpopulation. Once we start drilling into county and subpopulation, numbers start getting really small. So make sure you're taking the numbers in context when you're starting to drill down, but use this to kind of see, are there counties where folks are waiting a really long time for resources compared to others? And you could start to kind of work within your region to understand, is it because there's a lack of resources there? Is it because the volume of folks there is huge? Is it because they have a different assessment process? Kind of start to try to dig into some of those nuances. We also looked at the length of time on the by name list by race and ethnicity. Again, we look at leavers versus stayers. But what I find to be like a helpful way to look at it is for folks who exited the permanent housing, how long were they on the by name list? So you could see here, Hispanic Latino households, 91 days, white non-Hispanic 87 days, multiracial households 84, Black non-Hispanic 79. So you can start to drill in, especially with the race, different tabs displaying race. There are major differences in this by county, and by RAB. So you'll want to dig into this a little bit more. The county, the CoC wide numbers are helpful in their own way, but what's really helpful is when you start digging into it in your county and seeing, are there major differences happening in our county and why might that be? That sort of thing. All right. Next, we look at outcomes from the by name list. So this is, at the end of 2022, what happened with households who were waiting on the by name list. So as of December 31st, 43% of households on the by name list exited the permanent housing. So the folks who came through in 2022, 43% exited the permanent housing. That is an increase from last year's analysis, which was 37%. So that's something to be celebrated. To see an increase of households exiting the permanent housing is definitely a success to be celebrated. So kudos to you all, and definitely kudos to the coordinated entry team who cleaned up the list, because I think that really helps us have a more accurate understanding of what's really happening with households. You can dig into this by date, by household type. You could see here 44% of DV survivors exited the permanent housing, 45% of youth, 47% of veterans, 41% of chronically homeless households, and then you can dig into it by RAB and county. But I want to show you the next tab, because you can use this to really try to compare across RAB. So what this shows you is the exit destinations by RAB. So in the Northwest RAB, 48% of households exited the by name list to permanent housing, and 41% in the Southwest RAB. When you open this up to dig into the individual counties, it's easier if you filter by RAB first, because then you're not looking at this like crazy amount of counties. But if we want to see just the permanent housing exits, you can kind of compare and see, okay, Warren has 73% exits to permanent housing, and that was 47 households, which is, really amazing. And some counties saw a lower amount of folks exiting the permanent housing. So you can kind of dig into this and see if there's, some counties that are having more success. And that may be attributed, again, to multiple things. For example, in Washington County has one of the highest demands for resources in the CoC, and maybe the resources just are not on pace with what the demand is. So those are the type of things locally you can really dig into with this data and understand what's happening. Or you can look at counties that are having, a pretty high rate of success to understand. Another thing I'll note is the missing households. Some counties had a lot more households where their exit destination is missing. That could be for like multiple reasons. It could be they lost touch, you haven't been able to get in touch with them, or X number of days have passed and then they're exited from the by name list because of no contact. Those are things you may want to look at locally to understand, if we're missing, the majority of folks, we don't know what happened to them. How can we better track what's going on? For example, in Butler, 20 households were missing, which is, I think, the lowest in the entire CoC. So what's Butler doing to keep track of folks who are coming through coordinate entry? Maybe we can learn from them. So kudos to Butler and many of the counties. These individual data points are not necessarily like, pointing to flaws within different communities. It's more to say your community is going to know how to use this data and say, okay, let's see what's going on in our county. Where can we improve? Where are we doing really well? Where can we maybe partner with our neighboring communities? And I think as the coordinated entry system is kind of evolving over this upcoming year, I think there'll be a lot of room to kind of use this data to identify maybe where the pain points are and where some improvements would be helpful. And you all can do this on the local level as well as at the CoC level. We also look at outcomes by race and ethnicity. Again, what I like to do here is I like to highlight these categories and kind of compare and contrast. So you'll see here, 45% of white non-Hispanic households who came through coordinate entry exited to permanent housing, 39% of Black non-Hispanic households, 41% of Hispanic Latino households. And once we get into these other categories, we're talking about like pretty small numbers, like 3 households. So again, hover over it and see how many households we're talking about. But you could see here, white non-Hispanic households did have higher rates of exit to permanent housing versus Black and non-Hispanic and Hispanic Latino households. Again, drill into it for your county, for your RAB. There's definitely differences when we start to drill into it by RAB, for example, and by county. So use those filters to really dig into your local data and see if there's things going on that merit further exploration. I'm flying through this because there's not a lot of questions. So if you have a question you've been wanting to ask but haven't yet, feel free to jump in, raise your hand, or type it in the chat. All right, I'm going to talk through how we calculate demand for housing and services. So one thing that we do through this gaps analysis is we make some informed assumptions, basically saying, of these 3,122 households who came through coordinated entry, what do we know about them, and how can we use that to understand what type of intervention might that household need to end their homelessness? And this is an informed assumption. Obviously, each household is individual. Each household's needs are nuanced. So this is our best kind of estimate. It's not perfect, but it does help us kind of understand what the volume of needs are for different types of intervention. So let me talk with you through how we did this. So if a household came through coordinated entry, but they're not homeless yet, they're at risk of homelessness, maybe they're doubled up, maybe they're facing eviction, but they're not homeless yet and they're not fleeing domestic violence, we're going to assume those households most likely need some sort of prevention intervention, which could be funding, it could be services, combo of those two things to help folks, help prevent folks from becoming homeless. For folks who are homeless or fleeing DV, and they have a disabling condition, meaning they self-report that they have some sort of disability that's long-term in nature, and they're scoring high on the BI-SPDAT, so in the upper range, we're going to assume that those households might need a more intensive intervention to end their homelessness. So, for example, permanent supportive housing, but it could be some other type of high-intensity service intervention. We use PSH and RAPID kind of as a proxy for different types of service interventions because that's the majority of the inventory in the CoC. There are other resources that maybe are outside the CoC, like PHA vouchers or housing that's specifically for folks with like intellectual disabilities or things like that. So we say PSH, but this could be any type of kind of high intensity service intervention. And then for folks who don't fall into either of these categories, who are homeless or fleeing DV, but they're not going to be prioritized for an intensive intervention like PSH, those folks we're assuming are going to need some sort of in-between, some sort of low or medium intensity service like rapid rehousing. Again, these are assumptions and they're not perfect because for PSH, for example, someone could have a disabling condition and a high BI-SPDAT score, but be completely fine and able to end their homelessness with a more intensive, less intensive intervention like rapid rehousing. Or there could be folks who have a disabling condition but aren't falling in the upper BI-SPDAT range who really are going to need a more intensive intervention. So again, this is our best estimate, but people are individuals and you know, it's our best kind of aggregate estimate, but each individual household obviously needs are going to be different. All right, so sorry for my cough. I'm a little under the weather today. So when we take what I just talked about, which is the annual housing and service demand by household type, this is kind of the best estimate of, on an annual basis, who's going to need what type of resources. So on an annual basis, there's going to be about over 1,300 households who we are going to estimate are going to need some sort of rapid rehousing intervention. 266 families who are going to need some sort of rapid rehousing intervention. And then there's some households who we estimate need rapid rehousing, but we don't know if they're a single or a couple. And then you'll see here the prevention need, singles and couples families with a prevention need, and then PSH over here as well. So you can really use this to dig in, especially at the county level, and say, okay, in let's say in Clearfield and Jefferson counties, let's see what the demand is on an annual basis for prevention versus PSH versus rapid, so that those counties maybe together can understand what the demand is locally, or you can drill in by RAB. I would especially encourage you all to use this when you're thinking about applying for new project funds, whether it's through CoC, ESG, or any other funding source. A lot of project applications ask you for data about the need, and you may see, okay, in my particular county, especially if you're in a smaller county, there may not be like a high demand in your particular county, maybe because not a lot of people are coming through coordinated entry, or folks who are experiencing homelessness maybe aren't captured by coordinated entry, or whatever the reason is. But that's when you could kind of look and see, well, let's see what's going on in our neighboring counties. Maybe if we partnered on a project, you know, in the Northwest RAB or with our neighboring counties, maybe that could really make a competitive project. You can also use this to drill in for subpopulations. I would definitely encourage you to do that if you're thinking about applying for new funding specifically to serve a subpopulation, because you'll want to make sure that the data kind of supports whatever the type of project is that you're applying for. The next tab, you can drill down with a different way of looking at it. So I mentioned maybe you want to see how you could partner with your neighboring counties on a project. So for example, if you're in the Northwest RAB, you could say, okay, let's see, you know, where the demand is. For example, we want to create a new PSH project or a new rapid project or whatever the case may be, or maybe we don't know what's needed and we want to drill in. You can use this to kind of understand what the needs are across your community, and even more so if you start drilling in and saying, well, what's the need specifically for youth in the Northwest RAB based on coordinated entry data, or what's the need for veterans? Just a note with the DV survivors, once you start drilling in by county, the numbers get a little bit skewed because, again, we're missing county for folks. So just make sure you're taking that into account. You can use this to really drill into what some of the estimated needs are in your community. All right, so I talked about the housing inventory. I talked about coordinated entry, who's coming through and what their needs are. So the last couple of slides I'm going to go through really kind of bring it all together. And I'm going to walk you through it because it looks overwhelming, but I'll walk you through what it is. So what this slide looks at is on an annual basis, what's the demand for a resource like rapid rehousing versus the supply. So this first tab looks at the total number of households who we are estimating might need rapid on an annual basis. And this line that says entire CoC, these are the households where we don't know what RAB they're in. And then we look at the total CoC funded units of rapid rehousing. And then these ones that say entire CoC, these are units that serve the entire CoC and aren't specific to a RAB. Then we look at the ESG rapid. ESG rapid is just looking at the ESG rapid units in use the night of the pit count. That's kind of the best estimate we have. So the ESG inventory actually may be higher than this, is likely higher than this on an annual basis, but this is kind of the best estimate we can come with. And then we add the CoC and ESG units together to come up with the current capacity to meet the demand. So for anyone who's like a math person, there's the methodology down here. So we take the total units times turnover rate. So how often is a rapid unit turning over? We are using 100% turnover rate. What that means is one unit is going to turn over every year. So 12, if you have a unit, approximately every 12 months, it's going to turn over. That's kind of a conservative estimate because a lot of units turn over more often than that. The reason we use that is because the average length of time in CoC funded rapid is closer to 9 months, but we know that it's taking folks a while to fill units once they're vacant because it's hard to find new units. So that's why instead of using like a 9-month turnover rate, we're using a 12-month turnover rate to be conservative. So these estimates may actually, there actually may be more capacity than this reflects. So it's kind of conservative, but what this looks at is the total units times the turnover rate divided over the households needing rapid. So you'll see here the Northwest RAB currently has approximately 49% capacity to meet the demand for rapid, meaning on an annual basis, about 49% of the households who need rapid can most likely access it. And then 24% in the Southwest RAB, and then 34% overall. The 34% overall factors in the DV dedicated rapid rehousing as well. So you'll see here the Northwest RAB is somewhat better resourced than the Southwest. Both RABs lack capacity at this time, but the Southwest RAB sees a lot more demand, but actually doesn't have more units. So you can see here the Southwest RAB sees a sizable number of households, but isn't the resources aren't necessarily like evenly matched in terms of the demand and the supply. So something to think about if you're in the Southwest RAB, where are the gaps in your community that might need to be filled, although there are also needs in the Northwest RAB. So both RABs, there are definitely gaps, but just something to keep in mind. A lot of this is because certain counties see a really, really high volume of folks coming through coordinate entry in the Southwest RAB, and kind of looking at whether those counties have adequate resources is something we would encourage you to do at the local level. So this is the rapid rehousing estimate. And then we do a similar thing for PSH, but slightly different. So we look at the total PSH units. We do not include HUD-VASH, which are veterans dedicated units, because not everyone who's coming through coordinate entry would be able to access those. So we look at PSH demand and supply in two different ways. First, let's look at just the chronically homeless households. So if the CoC were to serve every single chronically homeless household, what's the capacity to do that? Because for those who aren't aware, all permanent supportive housing units in the Western PA CoC are chronic dedicated, meaning the unit has to be offered to someone, to anyone who's chronically homeless first, before you can serve someone who's non-chronic, which is based on HUD requirements. And chronically homeless, meaning folks who have a long length of time homeless, like a year or more, or over the course of 3 years, they have 12 months or more. And there's more rules around it, but that's the gist. So if the Western PA CoC were just to serve all chronically homeless households, the CoC has well over enough capacity to serve every chronically homeless household, which I've mentioned for the last few years, and it continues to be true. The Northwest RAB could serve 100% of the chronically homeless households and beyond. The Southwest RAB could serve well over 100%. So the CoC is positioned to be able to serve every single chronically homeless household coming through coordinate entry. Now, if you remember looking back, chronically homeless households, they don't have a 100% rate of exit to permanent housing. Some of the chronically homeless households are missing, or they have another exit destination. So this may be something the CoC wants to take a closer look at to understand, how are we making sure that the folks who are coming through coordinate entry who are chronically homeless are getting prioritized appropriately for PSH. All right, the second way we look at this is, okay, so not everyone who needs PSH is going to be chronically homeless. So if we're looking at households who may or may not be chronically homeless, but they have a disabling condition and a high VI SPDAT score, let's see what's the CoC's capacity to serve all of those folks. So currently the Northwest RAB has 47% capacity to serve all the households who might need PSH, Southwest RAB 52%, and overall 49%. And this is likely, if I had to guess, I would guess these percentages are even higher, because not all of these households who have a disabling condition and a high VI SPDAT score are necessarily going to need PSH. So my guess would be Northwest RAB has 47% capacity or higher. The one difference I'll note here versus the rapid rehousing tab I just looked at is the turnover rate that we apply is 25%, meaning each of these PSH units, we're going to estimate that only 25% of those units are going to turn over in a given year. And that is based on the CoC average, but that may vary very differently by county. Some counties, they may not turn over a unit in a year at all. And some counties may have a higher turnover rate. So unfortunately, I'm not able to dig into that level of detail. So this is just an overall CoC estimate. So that kind of gives you a picture of where the needs are, where the gaps are. Similar to previous years, there are more needs than resources, but the CoC does appear to be increasing its capacity to serve folks, which is excellent. That's really positive, and that's what we want to see. The last thing I want to note is there is a tab here with some DV-specific data. For some of the tabs previously where we weren't able to display DV-specific data, because we're not able to cross-tab it, meaning we're not able to dig into DV by county and by veterans and by youth. This kind of shows you more of an aggregated picture of the DV data, if that's of interest to you. So the average VI SPDAT score for DV survivors was 5.1, and for non-DV survivors was 6.6. And if anyone who's on the DV side wants me to try to drill further into some of this, I can attempt to do so, but I can't promise anything. I have to see what the data looks like. And then for DV survivors versus non-DV survivors had a longer length of time on the by name list. So DV survivors on average are waiting longer for housing resources and are not scoring as high. Again, sorry, we can't drill in by county and things, which is a limitation. The last thing we looked at is, I mentioned there's a lot of DV dedicated rapid rehousing that has come online in the last few years. So we were asked, can we look at just the DV household? So of all the DV households who report that they're a survivor of DV who need rapid, compared to how many DV dedicated rapid units are available, these units are the total funded units that are specific to DV. Not all of those units may be online yet, which I mentioned. The current capacity of the CoC to meet the demand for every DV survivor who needs it is 30%. So just to kind of give some context of where things are at with that. All righty, so we have some time left. And I know while I'm doing that, I'm going to put the link in the chat. So folks were like, I want to go back to that tab that Jessica mentioned. You could do that now or after the meeting. I know that in this forum, this Zoom forum, it's not the easiest to have open discussions, but we hope that if folks are having reactions that you might be open to sharing them with us. And if not, hopefully we'll have some more forums at your local meetings to discuss. But some of the things I'm hoping to hear from you about is, what's your impression of the data? What are you seeing through the data? What stood out to you? Are there things that you saw that you want to dig into more locally with your colleagues? Is there things that we didn't talk about but that you're seeing in your community as a need? Some of this may be hard to answer now because you haven't had a chance to dig into your local data yet, but any kind of overall impressions that you're seeing, we'd love to hear any thoughts or impressions that you're having. So feel free to come off mute. I think folks should be able to come off mute. And if not, feel free to use the reaction button and raise your hand if you have a comment or a question.
I've gone through this data and I've seen this presentation before, but every single time I'm wowed by all the bells and whistles that Tableau has. And I just am really excited that the data is now so much more accessible for folks to really dig into their county and region. So thanks for pulling this together, Jess.
I think the other thing that, this is Jamie again, the CE manager. I think the other thing that this data highlights is the need for the data to be there. That is one of the things that we found as we're going through the by name list is there's many instances because of missing data that it takes significant extra work on the part of the person from the agency and from the CE specialist, because maybe that person who originally entered the individual in is no longer there. So truly, the better that you can fill out the data fields, the more likely that folks are able to be contacted to get those housing offers. And so even if you are considering them like kind of quote unquote, your people, you know, please keep in mind, if you weren't there anymore, would someone be able to go in after you and be able to make this housing offer to this individual? Even quick notes in the case notes section of, you know, client contacted on whatever date really helps when we're doing the cleanup of the list, so that we know if people are current within 90, 60, 30 days, and or whether they should be exited. This also helps people, again, to spend less time making phone calls to individuals who are no longer even looking for housing or that there's not contact information for. So we really appreciate everybody putting in as much data as possible.
That's a really good point. There's kind of two layers of importance to the data. Is one, to serve people experiencing homelessness more effectively. If you don't have their contact info updated or don't know certain things about them, it's harder to connect them with the resources they need, or you lose contact. And then at the system level, as you all saw through this presentation, having complete data really helps us be able to understand what someone's kind of what the system is seeing as a whole. So it's definitely a great point, Jamie, about just reiterating folks keeping the data as updated as possible. Any other reactions, comments, questions, musings?
Hi, Jessica, it's Allison. I do have a question.
Yeah.
On your, hold on, I'm looking back here. So on the homeless dedicated housing inventory tool, what factors are you, what all is included in your permanent supportive housing inventory?
So the permanent supportive housing inventory is mostly CoC, but also VASH. Let me, I'll pull it up on the raw data side so you can see it over here. So let's say we just want to look at PSH. Most of these projects that you'll see here are CoC funded. So like ARC Human Services, Armstrong County, but you'll see some of them are VASH. So VASH that serves Armstrong, VASH that serves Clearfield. There's a few, a couple CoC, couple PSH programs in the CoC that are not CoC funded. We also have like the new youth, sorry, that says YDHP, but it should say YHDP, Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program. So that if you go to the raw data tab, you could see exactly what projects are included in the PSH. And I hope folks don't find errors, because this is based on, for CoC funded projects, it's based on your total funded units, and for others, it's based on the HIC. But if you do find something as you're digging in, let me know, because we'd obviously want to make sure it's correct for next year's HIC. But yeah, that's what it's included. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yes, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments? If you have a question, my guess is other people probably have a similar question. Happy to answer any, because we did go through that pretty fast. Alrighty, what I'll do is we can wrap up, but I'll stay on for a couple minutes if folks have questions, but don't necessarily want it to be recorded for posterity. You can stay on after the recording stops and ask if you have other questions. What I hope folks will do is take this data back to your teams, your LHOTs, your RABs, dig into it a little bit more, see what kind of gaps are in your community. Think about, you know, whether you want to apply for new funding, or whether there's some like process things in your community that maybe need to be strengthened. And then if you do have feedback, you can share it at RAB meetings, and Sierra will, or your Northwest Collaborative meeting, and Sierra or Lee will get that feedback back to me for the funding committee, or you can email the CoC email address, which I'll put in the chat. If you have questions or comments, you can feel free to reach back out. Thanks, everyone. And you'll get an email via the CoC mailing list in the next day with the link to the recording and the Tableau presentation.